As an ardent mountain biker, I was participating in a racing circuit and training for a long-distance event to round up the season. This necessitates extensive car trips. My husband and I had recently relocated to a small community north of Grand Rapids and needed to find a new route to ride in order to increase our saddle time and endurance. I had just bought a new road bike, but had not yet installed the new clip-on pedals in time for a fast ride. After a long day at work, I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to. The sun lowering on the horizon causes serious problems in West Michigan during the fall season. I recall riding out the driveway half-heartedly, my husband in front of me. We planned to run 20 miles and call it a day. I had never been on this route with him before, so I asked if he would mind if we just rode on a linear trail near our house. He persuaded me out of it, saying how delighted he was for me to see this new way. I walked along, my foot above the pedals, cursing the entire while. I should have taken a few moments to put them on. We passed a few runners who did not notice us approaching them and almost ran into us because they were blinded by the low sun on the horizon as we made our way to the rural part of the trip. I recall thinking that if they had been ran over by bicycles, it would have been an awful night for them. I recall double-checking at intersections as automobiles approached to ensure everyone could see us. We kept going, me cursing the whole time. I recall climbing a hill near a friend's house and wondering how they were. The next thing I recall is sitting in a field, close to a man. I don't recall what we were discussing, but I had removed my riding helmet, bandana, sunglasses, and bike gloves. I recall them sitting next to me in a tidy and orderly fashion. I couldn't see the man sitting next to me's face, but we were both sitting with our legs up and our arms across the tops of them. I recall a few laughs and pleasant talk as we gazed at an automobile parked at the crossroads of this road. The driver's side car door was open, and it seemed that the windshield had been shattered and forced inside the vehicle. There were no other automobiles or persons in the area. The field behind us was lush, and whomever grew the maize there had a bumper crop. In the air, I could smell fresh-cut grass or something earthly. It was extremely fresh and nice. The fact that I couldn't see the man's face disturbed me. We talked, but we didn't make direct eye contact, and I seemed to be staring at him out of the corner of my eye. It was almost as if I felt shy, but I had the impression I was connected to this individual. I recognized him, since he was my age, had black hair, and had a similar body to me. "Someone up there loves her very much and was watching over her," I heard a voice say. "We usually transport bike or car incidents to the back of the hospital rather than the emergency department." I was awakened by the sound of a small girl crying. When I looked around, I noticed that I was attached to a slew of wires and tubes on a white sheet gurney. When I saw my husband's face, I asked him what had occurred. He explained that we were riding east on a route with an unusual Y intersection when a young man driving west hit me. All my spouse heard was a loud screech, a big thump, and glass breaking because he was riding in front of me. As he turned around, he noticed that the windshield on the kid's car had been shattered and that there was a large ding on top of its hood. He watched the youngster leap out of his car, wailing and shouting, but he couldn't see me. By the driver's side front tire, my new bike had been crushed in half and was laying on the ground. My spouse leaped off his bike and dashed to his car. I was slammed squarely in the face, flipped headfirst into the windshield, and thrown to the ground on the passenger side of the automobile. My spouse dispatched the youngster to find a residence or someone nearby who could contact 911 because none of us had cell phones. He chose to roll me on my back because I was in a heap and he wasn't sure how bad my injuries were. He didn't appear to be injured, but he did note that my bike helmet had crumbled around my head. I was covered in blood and cuts, but no bones were visible. He stated he kept talking to me, telling me to convince him I was fine. I opened my eyes and asked who he was and what he desired. He said I was out cold again once I closed my eyes. The first responders arrived within minutes. An ambulance crew pulled over for a few minutes to eat dinner, not even a mile down the road. I was carried into the ambulance on a stretcher with head, neck, and spine boards. Because my vitals had gone so low, they immediately hooked me up to an IV and prepared to perform CPR. It took around 15 minutes to get to the hospital. When I arrived at the hospital, they promptly put me through a battery of X-rays and scans to determine what had broken. They were especially concerned since I'd had a significant concussion and my brain was expected to enlarge beyond the limitations of my skull. I recall a man standing next to me on the gurney, holding my hand as I went through each scan. He was holding my bike helmet at the time. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was the same man I'd spoken to earlier in the evening in the cornfield. I'd been in the hospital for quite some time before I regained consciousness. I was gone for approximately 2.5 hours. I turned around because the little girl was crying. I heard she just earned her driver's license and had rolled her car after swerving to avoid hitting a deer. I recall telling her I'd make sure she was okay and well cared for while I was there. There was also an older gentleman not far away from me who kept crying out in anguish. I told the doctor to forget about me and focus on him. As my memory improved, I couldn't recall how I got to the hospital and asked my spouse to explain. I was in pain. Every bone in my body hurt. I had a massive headache and blood all over me. All I could think of was getting out of there and going home. So I did. There were no broken bones discovered by the hospital. My vitals had returned to normal. My brain appeared to have calmed, and there was no need to keep me overnight. We had a method to drive home because a friend had dropped our car off at the hospital earlier in the evening. I recall crying the entire way home. The next morning, I awoke in full fog. My spouse had stayed up all night to keep waking me up to ensure that my concussion didn't worsen. I slept for 5 days in a row. I recall nothing about the day before the accident, nothing about the day of, save for my conversation in the field, and nothing for the next 5 days. I went back to work approximately a week later to attempt to keep things going. I couldn't even walk, and thinking was impossible. I had my husband take me to the location where I was hit once I regained my bearings. My bandana, sunglasses, and riding gloves were neatly piled on the ground, as if they'd been placed there and were eagerly waiting for me to return and grab them. My bike helmet had been crushed and splintered. My helmet's entire backside had been blown out. I could see what would have happened if I hadn't had this helmet on. I would have perished right there on the spot if I had smacked my head on the windshield. My family doctor referred me to an orthopedic surgeon for a consultation after I failed to recuperate after a few weeks. Following his examination, the doctor revealed that I had a torn ACL. Editor's note: one of the most critical major ligaments of the knee, connecting the bones of the knee joint, a torn Achilles tendon, and a damaged rotator cuff. This doctor also sent me to a neurologist for additional evaluation of my brain injuries. After that, I was referred to a doctor who works with people who had suffered severe brain injuries. Because of the blow to the head, I'd lost verbal, physical, and problem-solving abilities. Not only did I have 6 major operations to correct pieces that the hospital did not pick up, but I also had a lot of physical and brain injury treatment. It has taken nearly 10 years for me to return to a nearly regular life. My only discomfort is in my hips, and I occasionally have awful headaches. We went to the same hospital's emergency room the last time I had a headache. I heard a door open, and a man start talking to me. I opened my eyes and recognized the voice, but I'd never seen this man before in my life. I told him I recognized him but couldn't place him. After a brief talk, his eyes widened and he said, "You're that woman?" He turned out to be the paramedic on call that night. He stated he recognized me because bike or car accidents are never taken to the emergency room. I may have remembered him speaking to me when I was being cared for and transferred to the hospital. He reassured me once more that someone cared about me and was keeping an eye out for me that night. I'm not one to dwell on negative situations. I usually keep things like that to myself. However, I heard something on the radio a few months ago about accident victims and angels going to their aid. I was discussing it with my spouse when it came to me that we never discussed what we were discussing when we were sitting in the cornfield. He probed a little further when he gave me a look that indicated he wasn't sure what I was talking about. I told him we were discussing about something in the cornfield. I had removed my cycling gear, and we were sitting there staring at the automobile. He said, "I never sat up. We never sat in a cornfield since there wasn't one, and I was out cold for several hours." "Are you certain? I recall sitting there with you." "No discussions," he said. I've had a lot of spiritual activity this year and chose to seek spiritual guidance in order to deal with the intensity of my experiences. I was 22 years old when I lost the love of my life to a drunk driver. He had planned to ask me to marry him the next weekend, but he never got the chance. It was the most terrifying experience I'd ever had, and it left me bewildered and terrified for years afterwards. I met my spouse by chance, and we've been married for 25 years. He's fantastic, and life with him has been wonderful, especially considering where I was 30 years ago after my partner died. However, I never discussed this scenario with my husband or anybody else. Strange things started happening this year with my former love all over it. I sought spiritual guidance to figure out what was going on and why it was happening now. I was brave enough to ask about my accident and why I didn't die that night at one of my sessions with my spiritual therapist. The explanation, of course, was that it wasn't my time. That night, however, I learned something really interesting. I hadn't even placed the pedals on my new bike. That alone rescued me in more ways than the helmet did. I was asking if my hips were still bothering me. Yes. And I've gone all around trying to figure out why they're still hurting after all this time, I said. My spiritual therapist advised me that I had ignored all of the warning signs about not riding my bike that evening. Because I didn't take the time to put the pedals on, my angels were able to keep me from being hit by the car. They had my hips wrapped around theirs. My former sweetheart was sitting with me in the field and holding my hand at the hospital.